Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Today I want to talk about a case that hasn't just shaken up Washington, it's quietly forcing America to confront one of the oldest questions in our Constitution. How much power should a president really have? Earlier this month, the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in one of the most politically charged and economically significant cases in years, a case that could decide whether Donald Trump's global tariff plan was legal and what limits, if any, the Constitution puts on presidential authority over the economy. Now I know, tariffs doesn't sound like the kind of topic that keeps people up at night, but the truth is, this case goes far beyond taxes or trade policy. It's about the balance of power in America and whether one branch of government, the presidency, has quietly grown too strong. President Trump floated a plan to impose a 10% universal tariff on imported goods, basically a blanket tax on everything coming into the United States, from European cars to Chinese electronics. He claimed that power came from a law passed back in 1977, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Now, that law was originally written to give presidents flexibility in times of crisis, say, to freeze assets of a hostile nation, or cut off trade with countries that threaten U.S. security. It was not meant to be a permanent economic policy tool, but Trump's team argued that global trade imbalances themselves posed an ongoing national emergency, and under that reasoning, the White House could take sweeping action, including tariffs, without new approval from Congress. That argument raised eyebrows across the political spectrum. Supporters said it was bold leadership, finally using existing laws to protect American workers. Critics called it executive overreach, a president claiming emergency powers to reshape the global economy. And that's how we got to the Supreme Court. The question now isn't whether tariffs are good or bad policy. It's whether a president can use emergency laws to rewrite trade rules whenever he wants. The oral arguments revealed something really interesting. The divide wasn't just between liberals and conservatives. It was within the conservative majority itself. Let's walk through what the justices said, because it tells us a lot about how they're thinking. Chief Justice John Roberts zeroed in on the limits of executive power. He basically asked, if the president can use emergency authority to impose tariffs in normal times, then what role is left for Congress? That question cuts to the heart of the case. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to set taxes and tariffs. So if the White House can unilaterally tax imports just by declaring an economic emergency, that balance starts to look shaky. Then you had Justice Neil Gorsuch, who tends to be a strict constitutionalist. He warned that letting presidents stretch the definition of emergency too far could undermine the entire system of checks and balances. In other words, once you open that door, every future president can walk right through it. On the other side, Justice Samuel Alito took a more literal approach. He said, look, if Congress wrote a law allowing presidents to regulate imports, that could reasonably include tariffs. So if lawmakers didn't want that, maybe they should have written the law differently. Meanwhile, Justice Amy Coney Barrett raised a practical concern. If the court were to strike down the tariffs, would that mean refunding billions in taxes already collected? That kind of uncertainty could send shockwaves through the economy, and the liberal justices, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, were skeptical from the start. They questioned whether Trump's interpretation of IEEPA would give future presidents almost unlimited power to manipulate trade policy. So, what we saw wasn't a clean ideological split. It was a genuine institutional debate, how to preserve a strong presidency without letting it swallow Congress's authority. For me, this case isn't just about Trump or tariffs, it's about the American presidency itself. For decades now, both political parties have been complicit in expanding executive power. Whenever Congress doesn't want to make a tough decision, it punts the problem to the White House. That's how we got here, to a place where emergency laws are being used for long-term economic strategy. Trump didn't invent this trend. He just took it to its logical extreme. And now the Supreme Court has to decide whether to draw a line, and if so, where. If you've followed the Roberts Court over the years, you know one thing: it hates chaos. It almost never issues sweeping rulings that would instantly disrupt major parts of the economy. That's why I believe the justices will probably issue a narrow, balanced decision, one that keeps the existing tariffs in place, but sets clear limits on how far a president can go with emergency powers in the future. They might reaffirm that yes, the president has flexibility under IEEPA, but only in true emergencies, and they'll likely signal that Congress needs to rewrite or clarify the law so it can't be abused. That would be a classic limited ruling, the kind of middle ground that preserves stability while quietly reasserting constitutional boundaries. That kind of outcome would make sense not just legally, but politically. Because if the court were to strike down the tariffs entirely, it would throw trade policy and parts of the U.S. economy into chaos. But if they let the president do whatever he wants under emergency powers, they'd be setting a dangerous precedent that future presidents could exploit. So the middle road is the responsible one. Keep things stable, but draw a legal fence around presidential authority. That's how the Supreme Court tends to operate: slow, careful, and allergic to sudden disruption. What I find fascinating about this whole debate is how it reflects a deeper divide in American politics. Not between left and right, but between generations of governing philosophy. Older models of government assumed Congress would be the driving force, debating, compromising, legislating. But today's politics is fast, emotional, and hyper-partisan. People want action, not deliberation. That pressure has shifted power to the presidency. Every modern president, from Obama to Trump to Biden, has used executive orders and emergency powers to bypass gridlock. And that's exactly why this case matters, because it forces us to ask whether we've gone too far down that path, whether the American presidency has grown too powerful for the system the founders designed. Each justice in this case, regardless of ideology, is wrestling with the same fundamental tension. How do you balance efficiency and accountability? If the president can act unilaterally, government runs faster, but democracy weakens. If Congress reclaims every authority, progress slows, but checks and balances are restored. There's no perfect formula, but what's encouraging is that the justices are asking the right questions. They're not just talking about Trump or tariffs, they're talking about the future of American governance. That's a good sign. Personally, I believe presidents need a certain amount of flexibility. The world moves fast. Crises don't wait for Congress. But flexibility isn't the same thing as unlimited power. If every policy disagreement becomes an emergency, then the term loses all meaning. That's the danger of relying too heavily on executive authority. It slowly normalizes exception as the rule. So yes, presidents should have room to act quickly when genuine emergencies arise. But those actions should always come with clear limits, congressional oversight, and sunset clauses that prevent power from becoming permanent. That's the healthy balance our system was built for. One thing that's frustrated me, watching coverage of this case, is how oversimplified it's been. Some outlets call it Trump's overreach. Others frame it as a fight for America's economic independence. Both miss the point. This isn't about Trump. It's about whether the tools we've given presidents, tools meant for wartime or genuine crisis, should be used to reshape long-term economic policy. That's not a left versus right question. That's a constitutional question. And it's one we should all care about because it determines how our democracy functions, no matter who's in office. So here's my best guess about how this will play out. The Supreme Court will likely release its decision in December, and I expect it will say something like this. 1. The president does have emergency powers under IEEPA, but they're meant for short-term, exceptional situations. 2. Using those powers for broad, permanent tariffs pushes the boundaries of the law. The court won't immediately strike down the tariffs to avoid economic disruption, but it will signal to Congress it's your job to update this law and reclaim your role. In other words, no dramatic reversal, no sudden economic shocks, but a clear constitutional correction. That would be a measured, responsible outcome, and it would fit the Roberts Court's cautious style perfectly. This decision will shape more than just trade policy. It'll influence how future presidents, Democrat or Republican, think about executive authority. If the court reins in presidential power, it might encourage Congress to start taking responsibility again. If it doesn't, we'll keep drifting toward a system where every major policy change comes from the White House. Either way, this case is going to be remembered as a turning point, a quiet but pivotal moment in the long struggle over who governs America, the people's representatives, or one elected individual. The real lesson, I think, is that the American system still works, just not always in the dramatic way we imagine. The court isn't there to score political points. Its job is to maintain balance, to keep the system from tipping too far in any one direction, and that's what's happening here. The justices are wrestling with a problem that's been building for decades, a Congress that avoids conflict, a presidency that fills the void, and a nation caught in the middle. If this ruling nudges us even slightly back toward equilibrium, that's a win for the Constitution. So, here's where I land. I think Trump's tariff plan was aggressive, maybe too aggressive legally, but it came from a place of frustration that many Americans share. The trade system feels rigged, the political system feels stuck, and presidents, no matter their party, feel pressure to act. But as understandable as that is, it's not sustainable. If every president keeps stretching the definition of emergency, eventually the guardrails break. That's why this Supreme Court case matters. Not because of who wins or loses, but because it tests whether our system still knows how to say enough. If the court can reaffirm limits while keeping stability, that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Because at the end of the day, the health of a democracy isn't measured by how fast it moves, but by how carefully it guards its balance of power. So as we wait for this ruling, I'm cautiously optimistic. Not for one side or the other, but for the idea that even in divided times, the American system can still correct itself. And if that's true, then maybe there's still hope that our institutions, battered and bruised as they are, still work. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Should presidents have this kind of trade power, or is it time for Congress to step up again? Let's talk about it. Until next time, stay informed, stay grounded, and take care of each other.